you see. So why don't we take a round around the panel and, in a couple of sentences, we hear from you. What is your view of where are we on ESG diligences? Let me start with Bill and then over to Andy, and then we.
Thank you, Kunal, and good morning to everybody from Washington, D.C. So I think where we are in the world probably depends on where you are in the world. And I imagine that each of us on the panel has a very different answer to that question. At least from the US perspective and the EU perspective, which are the jurisdictions that my practice most dovetails, at least in the ESG space, I think we're in the middle of a major transition. Clients are basically trying to adopt an anti-corruption framework, or one based on more traditional concepts of financial materiality, to fit a much broader set of concerns that fall under the ESG umbrella. So for example, right now there are numerous human rights impact assessments that I see when we do ESG due diligence, but there doesn't seem to be any real consensus about what those look like. I think that's a function of the lack, at least in the United States, of a regulatory framework for ESG disclosures. It's currently a voluntary regime, and without a specific set of mandatory disclosures, clients have broad discretion about what, if anything, to say, and that translates into ambiguity. And the Big Four have different approaches, clients have different risk tolerances, and the ratings agencies are all over the place, all of which is going to change once the SEC regulates disclosure requirements, which could very well happen this year. I think we'll have a more uniform set of standards. But right now, it's a very dynamic space. There's some base minimum, I think, agreement on what ESG means, but the devil is really in the details, and the details really do vary from deal to deal, sector to sector.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Andy, what's your view from where you see the transactions?
Yeah, I would agree with Bill. It still feels quite early, both in respect of companies' approaches and investors' approaches to ESG. It's interesting because, it feels somewhat like we have seen previously with anti-bribery, anti-corruption, sanctions, cybersecurity risk, where there suddenly gains a momentum for investors and regulators to really hold companies' feet to the fire. I think there are a couple of additional factors that also come into play. When you look at the different types of legislation that Bill was referring to, even in respect of the EU, it's looking a lot more prescriptive and already prescribing different types of expectations, both in terms of what for example, the mandatory due diligence would look like. What are the thresholds being looked at? What are the expectations around diligence? What are the expectations around monitoring? And really, I think pulling into it a lot of the experience that regulators and others have seen from bribery and corruption, sanctions, as I say. And the other area where things are starting to accelerate somewhat, and I think adds to the complexity, is that there are very sophisticated NGOs who are well ahead, perhaps even of some companies and some of the regulators, who again are looking over disclosures already, looking over the mandatory diligence requirements already, and therefore getting ready to pressure companies, both in respect of the legal requirements, but of course, just as important in terms of the reputational risks as well.
Great, thank you. And Sheila, you have extensive experience, especially in the Middle East region. Do you see the same sort of development, or is this, when you speak with the investors, when you work in transactions, what do you see in terms of ESG, their attitude towards ESG diligence?
Sure. Yes, definitely. I think in the Middle East, we probably, in terms of the regulatory environment, are a little bit further behind the US and Europe right now. And I definitely agree with the others' remarks. It's very interesting to see ESG as a principle was really kind of established by the UN when they issued the Principles for Responsible Investment in 2005. So that's quite some time ago, and it seems that only very recently has it really taken hold of us in the world, and there's probably a multitude of reasons why that might be, but we are where we are today with a concept that has been around for quite some time. but relatively recent grasp of it, and in a global environment where no two regulations around the world are the same. And I think what's happening is that global companies and global GCs around the world who need to implement a global policy are really struggling right now. They're really struggling with knowing what the standard is, developing a standard that is going to work for them across multiple jurisdictions and not having disparate treatment within their own companies. So if we look to the future a little bit, I think what's going to happen is much like what has happened with the US FCPA. There will be a global standard that's probably developed not by multiple governments getting together and agreeing, but by global companies themselves, by necessity, having to set a global standard, implementing it around the world, and then that global standard will probably be adopted as best practices, just like we've done with the US FCPA.
Great, thank you, Sheila. Oliver, let me bring you in. I know you work extensively in India as well, and across the region. Any particular trends that you see, when you speak with the GCs or your clients, whether funds or otherwise, in terms of their attitude towards ESG diligence? Is this something which is a non-negotiable? Is good to have? What's your view, Bian?
Yeah, no, it's good, and thank you, and hello everybody. I think that it really depends. First of all, it depends on what you mean by ESG. So as Bill mentioned, we're only now really defining what that is, and it's a huge term. Like it means, the E in ESG is largely where people have focus, but now, as Andy mentioned, there has been a big focus on things like forced labor, and child labor and things like that. So you really have to define what that means when you are defining the trend. I think in Asia, most Asian jurisdictions have laws prohibiting slavery, forced trade, and have environmental regulations. The enforcement of those has traditionally lacked or lagged behind, places like Europe, UK, and the U.S. And so you look to those markets to see what's going to happen, and that's largely what a lot of funds, a lot of financial institutions, a lot of
Oliver is having connection issues. Just give him a minute. While Oliver joins back, Ankit, let me bring you in. You bring a very different perspective in this panel of a general counsel. From where you sit, and this comment is obviously not specific to the company you work for, but in general, from where you sit, what do you see as the biggest challenge for a GC in India? Of a large company, where do you see among the three, E, S, and G, where is the biggest challenge that you find? Ankit, you're on mute.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. Thank you, Vivek, for the question. While I agree with the views of the panelists out here that the ESG framework is still in transitionary stage and is growing day on day, but being part on the other side of the table, what I have realized is that companies are being a lot more proactive in disclosing where it is where we have to work upon. The companies have gone forward and taken up a self-declared, say, disclosures, which they are publishing, which are giving investors the confidence in the long-term sustainable working framework. I have reviewed reports of certain foreign jurisdiction. I have reviewed reports of certain Indian jurisdiction. I find that Indian companies are also pretty fast forward in the ESG reporting framework. In terms of challenges, the E, S, and G, each of these verticals have Indian laws which they have already agreeing upon. but the time has come to move forward, to bring that bar up. That bar up is coming through international recognition. There are funds being set up only to invest in international companies who adhere to such norms. These self-declared guidelines, which could be in line of TCFD or any other international global conventions, are giving investors the confidence in companies, especially India, and have moved in self-disclosure in all the forum. In terms of deficiency, the S factor is still to be looked into between a developed country and a developing country, which is where a lot of things will change over a period of time. The valuation methodology will probably have to be modified or delocalized in that sense. So that's my viewpoint on this.
Thank you, Ankit. I'm going to come back to you because I think there are a few themes in what you mentioned, especially about the cost and the benefit from where you see it as a GC. But let me come back to you. Let me just ask a few other points from the panel. Andy, in terms of when you see a past issue in a past ESG issue in a diligence, how do you look at the materiality of it? How do you assess the materiality? I mean, how do you, is there a risk? Is there something which has more weightage versus less? How do you see that?
I think it very much depends on, what are you talking about? Are you talking about an investment by a large multinational fund? Are you talking about an investment as a strategic investment? Are you talking about domestic investment? And then also, you really have to look at it from the legal perspective, I guess to some extent the accounting perspective, and also the reputational perspective. But I think the point that Oliver made is well made in terms of, the E, S, and G are very disparate types of issues, and obviously it's dependent on the nature of the investment, which of those elements, if not all, are going to be important to the investing company, its board, its investors, consumers, and regulators and the like. So I think it in somewhat similar to how anti-bribery, anti-corruption is looked at, it very much depends on the sort of the risk profile of the investing company and the decision that is made. And obviously, if for example, you're investing, working on behalf of a fund that is specifically looking at ESG requirements and promoting ESG requirements, then clearly that they will need to demonstrate that they are making the right choices, whether it's E, S, or G they're specifically focusing on. And I think the risk profile is something that has to be discussed across a lot of different stakeholders within the investing company or the investing fund. And I think that the way in which that is looked at is very much differently viewed, whether you're speaking to the general counsel, you're speaking to the business, you're speaking to HR, supply chain, procurement, etc. So the other issue that they may all face is the commercial risk, both in terms of making a misstep and possible liability in the future, but also looking at it from a commercial investment perspective, that if you have to change the way in which the business operates on the ground, is that going to change the financials within the company and how the investing company looks at it? I think Ankit, has made some interesting points in respect of, what companies are already doing. And I think one of the key focuses that companies are looking at is sort of the cost benefit analysis, both from a financial perspective, a regulatory perspective, consumer perspective. So it's a very difficult question to answer because it encompasses so many different areas. But it is an area of key focus within certainly our clients, and I'm sure many of the panelists' clients as well, and is more and more a factor of the actual specific due diligence criteria, whether it be from background checks, whether it be from due diligence questionnaires, requirements in virtual data rooms, and really sort of reviewing accounts and other documentation provided by the target companies, for example.
Thank you, Andy. Bill, from your experience, are there any particular, non-negotiables, which you see, these are across the transactions, across the regions, across the sectors that you see, these are the deal killers, if you will, that if these were to be found or identified in an ESG diligence, then, your money will be on the fact that more likely than not, the investor is not going to go ahead with the transaction.
That's a great question. I mean, I think Andy hit the nail on the head when he said that ESG is basically in the eye of the beholder, and different clients have different sensitivities. But I do think that there are some concerns that cut across sectors, that cut across investment perspectives. The one in the United States that's particularly salient, given the Me Too period, is the Me Too movement, is issues around sexual harassment and abuse in the workplace. Diversity and inclusion are harder to translate to sort of an international perspective, but those are certainly issues that crop up on every due diligence list that I've seen around these issues.
And Bill, on what we call in India POSH, which is a legislation governing sexual harassment in India, on those sexual harassment issues that you see, is it that the investors find that there were allegations and they were not resolved to the level of governance practices, the good governance practices that you would expect a responsible company to be doing it? Or is it the general behavioral issues that you would find as the general culture of, bullying or a lot of other malpractices that you see in companies?
I would say it's both. I mean, and definitely workplace practices and the treatment of labor are also issues that you see come up again and again, where basically, developed countries are importing their own value structure and their own belief around what a healthy workplace looks like to an environment that doesn't exactly fit that perspective. So I think it looks at both systemic issues, but also in particular, because this is the real sensitivity from an investment perspective, allegations involving management. And even if there has been an investigation, oftentimes clients will want us to essentially do a de novo review and do an independent assessment about the claims. They're often not willing to just accept that there had been a review or a fact finding around a particular issue, and they want to get comfortable based on their own standards and their own expectations around what the conduct was and what it wasn't.
Got it. Sheila, when we do ESG diligence in India, there are, as Ankit was alluding to, there are real, regional peculiarities that we face. Like, one common issue for a manufacturing company for which, let's say, we are doing an ESG diligence is, whether they provide, the same sort of facilities for their contract labor, right? That goes into the sort of the S bucket of the ESG, and very, very, very specific, right? Very basic that you would expect. For example, do you provide, sanitary and hygiene facilities to the female employees, female contract workers? Basic things like washrooms and clean sanitation facilities, etc. Anything that comes to your mind from your experience in terms of whether in the three different buckets of ESG, in the Middle East region or in Asia in general, that you see that the companies are most struggling with when you conduct diligence or when you have done investigations? Any particular pain points that you find for the companies in that region?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think the struggle is partially in the definition, like we've all been saying, and the level of availability across the world. So certainly what we find in the labor workforce in the Middle East, or what we find in the labor workforce in India or in anywhere across Africa may be very different than what a European company may find in manufacturing facilities in Europe. And so like we've been saying from the beginning, coming to a standard that looks the same for a global company that has operations all over the world can be quite difficult. But it's really, I think what we're talking about here is the S in ESG. And a lot of it can be adequately addressed through the G, I think, the governance. So if we're looking at a company that has a healthy governance system, it has healthy policies, it has whistleblower policies, it has healthy management of that, of those policies, procedure for complaints to be investigated and addressed. That's all the governance that looks into the social responsibility. And I think if we look to the G, then we have a little bit more comfort because defining the S can be a little bit difficult. But if we have policies that assist a company in looking at the S in a way that's a healthy investigatory way where problems can actually be addressed, then I think that gives a great deal of comfort to investors.
Great, great. No, very, very helpful. I think that is exactly right, that we see across in the deals that we work in India as well. Oliver, you do a lot of work, I know, on the investigation side, on even smaller companies in the region. What do they struggle the most with? Is it the governance piece, or is it the environment piece, or is it the social piece? At least in Asia region, when you sort of are conducting investigations or diligences.
Yeah, and apologies for my technical difficulties. I'm in a quarantine hotel in Hong Kong, and so I'm at the mercy of my phone and the internet hotel. So sorry about that. As far as what companies in India and the region struggle with most, ESG, again, like I'll sound like a broken record. It depends on what the issue is, but for me, it is the culture. It's the culture of understanding that these are real issues that don't only affect places like the US, the UK, and Europe. A lot of what we hear when we are doing investigations around environmental safety or environment or safety, or things like forced labor, human rights, we hear that companies certainly care about these things, but the actual strictures, the actual provisions of the law, and what is being required to do, we often hear companies around the region say, well, you just don't understand how it works here. You don't understand, we care about these things, but this is a Western thing. You don't understand what it takes to make money here. And I hear that, and I sympathize with that. I really do. A lot of the standards that are imposed don't take into account local realities. And so it's up to us as practitioners and in-house attorneys and investors to do that, to try to instill a culture of ESG compliance. And that takes training, that takes messaging from leaders, and that takes a lot of consistency. Like Sheila said, it is the G that is really going to drive that compliance. It's establishing, right from the top, whether it's an ESG steering committee, whether it's a chief integrity officer, whether it's both. It's showing your employees from the top that you actually do take this seriously, and this is a company issue, not a Western values issue that's being imported and imposed upon a local company. Now, that said, there are definitely chances to tailor policies, procedures, and outcomes to local realities, and that does involve really close collaboration with local leaders, getting their buy-in, and that's really the issue that I see the most.
Thank you, Ankit. That's a good juncture to bring you in. You alluded to, and you and I both have seen, there are a lot of local laws, right, on each manufacturing facility, each facility that a company has on that govern, ESG. And as Oliver was saying, you aren't trying to create or superimpose, Western values on companies, on local companies. Now, I get when there are basic statutory compliances that you have to follow, because if you don't follow that, that's a bare minimum to follow. And if you don't follow, obviously the penalties and the statutory strictures going to follow, right? The issue is when an investor comes in and asks for something which is over and beyond what is the statutory minimum statutory requirement, right? How does it work from a cost and benefit analysis? From where a GC, how does a GC evaluate that, the cost and the benefits of going over and beyond what your what the bare minimum statute provides for, what the law prescribes, and obviously likely what your competitors are going to be doing in that area. How does the cost and the benefit analysis work? Ankit? I think Ankit is having tech issues.
So,
While we wait for Ankit to come back in,
am I audible?
let me just. I just want to shift gears and Ankit, are you back? Yes, you're audible now. Great. We lost you again.
Yeah. Kunal, am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible now.
Okay. Hopefully this thing stays on for a while. Uh, you know, the S framework within the ESG, it has been evolving in nature. We have moved right from 50, 60, 70s, from an economic development to a globalized economy. The laws are improving in nature. The multifarious laws in many domains, right from labor to social security to have been evolving and are evolving in terms of how the global economy and kind of are also replicating what the global economy is all about. With that in perspective, the cost and benefit analysis for superimposing a best practice is taken in the best interest of the company for an investment decision. I don't think a evolving cost only for meeting compliance is a mandate or criteria which anyone will have when it comes down to imposition of such additional condition for a safe working facility. In terms of reliance on and cultural acceptability and incorporation of day-to-day working, that is where a lot of manufacturing facility may face a bit of an issue, but a good facility does not hurt anyone. In terms of ESG, be it E, S, and G, even on the E, we have focused a lot on S, but on the E side also, the laws are evolving much faster. The courts have intervened, the courts have given a lot of guidelines which were technically are not there in terms of statutory interpretation for the existing statute. These guidelines are getting drawn from various principles of law which are there in the other jurisdictions. And all the companies are following that thoroughly. With that perspective in mind, the same approach will go for G. Like, for example, FCPA was mentioned earlier. It is equally applicable and equally adhered to here in India. We do not have a private bribery act here in India, but UKBA also comes into perspective out here. FCPA is already implemented. We have something else on the governance side, which is more to do with stockholders, shareholders, investments, and things alike, which are already there as part of our ecosystem. More compliance to these are guaranteed. And eventually, when the global funds flow in to India, most of the practices will be becoming uniform in nature and across geographies in terms of disclosures. So far as a statutory mandate in terms of compliance will be there, that will technically still be governed by the law or the statutory regime which the courts will follow. They will not go with the disclosure or the self-disclosure which are being made. So base minimum is mandatory. Anything beyond that is complementary and supports the entire industry per se, without a doubt. So the cost benefit analysis may not be a suitable way to put it up, in only sense that this cost will be borne by the company who are willing to grow forward.
Let me shift gears. So in terms of a deal cycle, so let's say you have moved from the stage of diligence and you have identified ESG issues in target entity, and you are counsel for an investor, a potential investor. And now your job is to put together a remediation plan. What are the key elements that are essential that you would say for a good remediation plan? And this is a question open for the panel. Anyone who wants to take this up, please do, and we would love to hear your thoughts in terms of an effective remediation plan or a first 100-day plan that you would prescribe for past ESG issues. What are the salient points of that?
So, Kunal, if you permit, I just want to
please.
add on that.
Yes, please,
So
please.
on the from an investor perspective, what anybody would look forward is the materiality of the let's say delta of the gap. So far as the materiality issue is addressed, the first 100 days goes into addressing the main let's say category A items. And therein the plan develops. There would be a lot of delta coming through when an investment is proposed, but the A category, and that is how the materiality is defined, would be first be addressed. So that's my take, that you reclassify everything into a ABC category, address the A ones first to ensure that the ESG framework is complied to the maximum extent possible.
Thank you, Ankit. Andy, Sheila, Bill?
Kunal, I'll just talk.
Yeah, I mean, happy to jump in.
I'll talk the very short term.
Go ahead, Oliver.
Bill. Bring in Andy.
Thank you. So I'll talk through a few things for the short term. Obviously, remediating issues found in the due diligence is top priority because they're now your responsibility. But in those first 100 days, you really do just want to, first of all, establish a reporting line, figure out who is in charge of ESG within the company, figure out how that is going to be reported back up to the investor, and what exactly is going to be reported up to the investor, so that during that initial stage you can really get an idea of the progress. I would say practically figure out what you can do within those 100 days, whether it's implementing a policy, putting together a training program, understanding that you're not going to be able to train everybody in the company usually within the first 100 days. What you want to do is go for those quick wins, go for those kind of low-hanging fruit that you can do in the very short term, policy work, communications, establishing a reporting rhythm, just so you can build that momentum within the first 100 days or 3 months, or however you want to put it. Apologies, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it depends on sort of the ES and G and what has been found, as Oliver referenced. I mean, in terms of the G, that's probably the easier side of things to look at, because a lot of it's sort of framework either through local statutory requirements, or if you're having to deal with overseas regulatory requirements, then there's a pretty well-trodden road in terms of what needs to be achieved. But I think the point also that was made earlier, that you're just not imposing the views and standards of, let's say if it's an overseas investor, on the local situation is incredibly important, because as well as reporting, rapport is clearly very important. The culture that Oliver referenced is vital, and clearly as part of an investment, whether it's a strategic investment or it's a financial investment, the investing company will have taken stock of, for example, the quality of the board, the quality of other functions within the business. And then I think pretty quickly, assuming that they want to move forward with the folks that are on the ground, that there has to be a rapport built, there has to be a partnership, and really have buy-in, not only strategically from the more senior management, but the middle management, and then flowing down through the business. Because if all you're doing is just imposing some policies and procedures framework at a high level, it's really not going to achieve anything. And so as part of the 100-day plan, there's a lot of efficiency to be gained by, clearly there may be uplift of accounting controls, there may be uplift of board controls, there may be an appointment of a compliance function for the very first time, or indeed, sort of an ESG type officer. But looking at it from a sort of a more holistic level often achieves greater results faster. But obviously there are areas, as Oliver identified, where the low-hanging fruit to get easy wins, to get that momentum going, is actually very, very helpful. And building that partnership with the local team on the ground is going to be vital. The social, the S side is probably a little bit harder if you're looking at sort of the sort of whether it's sort of human rights, whether it's slave labor, etc. It's a bit more difficult. But the other areas that people have talked about in terms of, you referenced Canal, POSH and other areas, and Bill referenced in terms of sexual harassment and things like that. A lot of that will flow from culture. And I think understanding that and building on that is going to be important. But having milestones through the process, clearly you have 100 days, there is a target. Often you don't achieve those 100 days, but knowing what can be achieved and what can be left behind to be achieved following the 100 days is also important as well. It has to be a flexible plan. Things will change. We've seen the world change in the last few weeks very, very quickly, and people weren't really expecting that. So being flexible, being nimble within those 100 days, I think is probably more important than ever at the moment.
Great. Bill, Sheila, do you want to comment on that? Any thoughts on what the investors expect? What regulators will be probably a stretch, because there is no regulatory framework. There's no one regulatory framework. But any thoughts on what is a good 3 or 4 points that a good remediation plan should have? Whoever wants to go first.
Sure, happy to. Very briefly, I think one thing that we tend to counsel on is, within the first 100 days, obviously making sure that whatever is done in terms of remediation is not just cosmetic. And I think a lot of times companies fall into the trap of implementing change that they think looks and sounds good, but without the real structure or policy that gives it teeth. And that actually is a recipe for a disaster, because then what you've done is you've created a policy without the ability to follow it, and then you've created the evidence to hang yourself for actually not having followed through on the policies. So I think that's if I were to say one thing that is an element of caution that we've seen unfortunately go wrong too many times within that first 100 days, it's that. Make sure that what is being implemented in terms of remediation has an appropriate structure, policies, controls to give it teeth, because otherwise it just fails.
Bill,
I was just going to say, Kunal, I think the other panelists hit on all the critical salient high points of what a good remediation plan looks like. The only piece I would add to is the communication strategy, right? Figuring out how you're going to message what you've done, both internally to the workforce, which is something that investors and business partners will often ask about in diligence down the road, right? What were the lessons learned and how were those shared with people contemporaneously? And then in the same vein, thinking about how you message this incident or this remediation to your foreign partners, because while, again, it is unfair to try to import and fix these issues in the context of a Western perspective, a solely Western perspective, your investors, your business partners have ESG obligations, have taken on disclosure obligations that creates liability for them. So thinking about how you can message this to them in a way that they can use, arm them with talking points, so that they feel comfortable that they can deal with their own regulators, they can deal with their own investors. And I find it's usually helpful to talk about it in the language of ESG, right? So there was this issue at the factory, but we remediated it. And as a result, we're going to be able to keep these jobs, right? Which give women an entry point to the workforce and that ensure daycare for their kids and contain pollutants or whatever the issue might be, but put the spin on it accurately. That the remediation is also, fitting into a larger ESG agenda that helps the client.
Great.
Or helps the investor.
On that point, are you seeing any instances? I know you have been at DOJ and have worked closely on SEC matters also. What's the regulators' view on this? Are you seeing any any of the ESG diligences or issues emanating from ESG diligences making their way to either whistleblower hotlines, or going to the point of leading to self-disclosure being made to the regulators? What's the regulators' view on this? What's the lay of the land that you see?
Well, I haven't seen a rush of self-disclosures lately, and it's not necessarily the first advice we give. But I think even though we're in a voluntary regime in the U.S. and we're going to be moving toward a more mandatory one closer, I assume, to what the EU has in place. I think that framework will probably be a model for the SEC, which is going to come out with its regulations, we think, this year. Even though it's voluntary, the SEC is very actively doing sweeps right now, focusing first on asset management funds that made representations about being ESG focused. So last summer, they sent out a wave of document requests, voluntary document requests, but requests asset managers are going to respond to, asking how their investment portfolios actually align with their ESG messaging, with their representations they made about what their goals are. And so there's a real push going on right there. And I think that will likely yield some activity on the enforcement front, probably, by the end of this year or early next year. It's been identified as a priority and an exam priority by the Division of Exams at the SEC. But equally, I think telling, the SEC has created an ESG task force, and it's within the enforcement division. So even though we're in this voluntary regime, I think the message there is that any representations you made are going to have teeth, and we're going to hold you to account. And so there are investigations underway. Again, the life cycle of these things is such that it takes a while for them to actually yield a public action, but that seems like it's coming. And certainly the SEC chair, Gary Gensler, has made very clear that this is a cornerstone for his enforcement program. So I think there's going to be a lot more activity, and as a result of that, we're going to see, I think, sharper, more comprehensive due diligence questionnaires going out, as we did in the FCPA, right? There's past is prologue, and 30 years ago, people were wrestling with what an FCPA due diligence process looked like. Now we have a very good idea because we have a wealth of data from enforcement actions, from other experience that we all have on this call, on this Zoom. And the same thing's going to happen with ESG, and I think it'll happen. We're going to see a real seismic shift in the next year.
Excellent. And in terms of, let's just talk about communication strategy. I think it was mentioned, Bill, you alluded to it, and Andy, you mentioned this. Let's say you have identified the issue, you have come up with a remediation plan, and now there's a lot of data that you have identified, and this has to go to investors. If you are representing a fund, then your investment committee, the LPs, the board of the target entity, how a lot of communication to external stakeholders as well as internal stakeholders. Any tips for companies in India that are going to undergo this sort of that will be a target of these investments, and will be undergoing any sort of ESG diligence, and therefore will be sort of looking at what is the right communication strategy? I know, I think, Bill, you or Andy mentioned that it has to be the right spin in terms of how you, the issues that are identified and look more forward looking. But any other tips in terms of how the board should be looking at it, how the investors should be communicating to other investors? What are the do's and don'ts of a good communication strategy post identification of issues at ESG? It's a question open to the panel, so anyone wants to come in, more than welcome.
One thing that I would say, and particularly because we're seeing it in a lot of consumer actions and NGO cases, is a good word of caution is to not overreach in your communications. And we're seeing the results of that today because of all of the greenwashing cases and climate change litigation. Now, as is being mentioned with regulatory investigations, what did you say in your statements, and is it accurate? In today's world, everything that we write and say is either recorded or kept on the internet for all time. And so it is really important that statements be made truthfully and accurately, and that they don't overreach what is actually being done.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Just it's a great point that Sheila made. You really want to engage with your PR team or your PR consultants early, before an incident happens. I mean, companies violate laws all the time. ESG is an area that the public is very interested in. And we talk about, whistleblower reports to the SEC and the like. Out here in Asia, you're more likely to get a whistleblower report to a media reporter, a journalist. And then it ends up in the newspaper, especially if it's something about slave labor, some environmental disaster. Then everything goes out the window and you are executed on day one by the public. And so it really does bear repeating that you do need to have a strategy in place from the beginning, and make sure that is, as Sheila mentioned, not overreaching, and it's truthful and accurate, and it's consistent with your reporting obligations. For example, if you're in India under the Companies Act, if it's a fraud matter, then your auditors might be making a report, and that's got to be consistent with what you're saying. So it's a lot to think about, and the earlier you can put in place controls to start that process before an incident happens, the better.
Great point, Oliver. I think I'll just add in my bit in my experience from India. I think we always advise our clients when they are looking at remediation aspects to always think of what is going to come 2 steps down the road. So there are a lot of times people don't understand that auditors have their own obligations, and given the world that we are living in, auditors are really careful about what they are signing off at the end of the year, right? And you don't want qualified accounts in your financials. So that's a great point you made, Oliver, because if you do the remediation, and if you have sort of communicated it rightly, you have put in place the right things for the auditors to say, okay, fine, issues can happen with anyone. You looked at the issues, you identified the issue, remediated the issue, and you're reporting to us in time. So we understand that, and any other stakeholders would probably understand that as well.
Maybe if I just jump in very quickly. I mean, I totally agree with Oliver in terms of having that plan ready and to go well before any issues arise, because if you're having to put it in on day one, it's already too late. I mean, the rise of social media of all formats is something that really is something difficult for companies to grapple, particularly, for example, in probably the E and the S side of ESG. They can be very emotive subjects, and it's very hard to stop the momentum once it gets going. But also thinking it through, that there may be a knee-jerk reaction to move one way rather than another. But actually, I think a lot of companies have seen that they've gone down a particular tack thinking that it was the right approach, but actually there are other stakeholders with an opposing view that actually thinks that that's not the right stage, a right direction to go. So you want to avoid flip-flopping, but through your communication strategy as well. And the initial knee-jerk reaction might not necessarily be the right one. So getting involved with stakeholders early with your PR strategies is obviously important. And then also, thinking it through from your auditor's requirements, from your legal requirements, your disclosure requirements, is going to be important. But it's very difficult to do if you're not already prepared and ready to go and have the resources in place and at least which buttons to push once these sorts of issues arise.
That's right. That's right. In terms of communication, how does it vary for companies that are regulated, i.e., either they are listed companies or the companies that are governed by let's say the US or EU legislations? Any experiences in terms of what are the things that you would say communication wise? Is it wise to approach the have a council with the regulators first and let them know, look, this is going to come your way. Don't be alarmed by it. We are here to advise. Any tips for companies that are listed companies may have investors or LPs that are overseas, or they have companies that have subsidiaries overseas. Any tips on those companies in terms of communication strategy? Bill, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the strategy depends in large part on whether there's going to be a public disclosure. So if the issue that rises to the level of being material within the meaning of disclosure, then thinking actively, first of all, about how you're going to message this with your auditors, because more often than not, I find that your external auditors are some of the more challenging, stakeholders in the process, even more so than adversaries often in litigation. But I think, in terms of the communication strategy, I think getting them comfortable is obviously a priority. And I think the governance changes that people were talking about, having a reporting line to the board, having somebody who owns ESG across the organization is really important, particularly because these ESG issues don't neatly fit into any one division, right? They span the entire organization. And so having somebody who's empowered to actually track and monitor that, and having the milestones that I think Andy was talking about that are auditable by internal audit are all important. And being able to say that that's happening, right? Being able to say accurately that if an issue does arise that requires a conversation like this, you can at least point to having a governance framework in place that will address it, so that yes, there were gaps, there was a problem that arose, but we have the right structure to fix it. And again, we've talked about this before, and I think Sheila made the point very well that governance, can't be an easy band-aid to a real problem, right? It's the low-hanging fruit. It's the easy thing in a lot of ways to fix. But that being said, fix it while you can, but not do it in the middle of a crisis. The best way to manage a crisis is not to have one, but if you have one, at least be able to say, we have this infrastructure we built around ESG, so we're on this, right? And that message will convey confidence, I think, to whoever you're talking to.
Great. We do have some questions coming in from our viewers, and this is for anyone who wants to address this on the panel. How does the assessment, the ESG assessment, the diligence, vary for a small and medium-sized entity? And this is actually a real issue, especially on the S and the G side. In India and elsewhere in Asia, we have a lot of companies that are really the sort of this small but a very essential part of a global supply chain. When you are dealing with such entities, these are small and medium-sized entities. They may not have very large-scale operations. They may not be listed. And how does the diligence change? Is it modified, especially on the S and the G side?
Maybe if I just jump in quickly. I think like any investment, I think you scale your diligence and your work based on the risk profile and also the nature of the business that you're investing into. I think in terms of, if you are a medium or small size business, there are going to be different expectations from the authorities or from consumers. And frankly, if you don't have the bigger, deeper pocket, you may not be the target for, sort of litigation or other issues, but it may still have a local issue that causes problems for smaller, medium-sized companies. I think one of the areas that is a problem for small and medium-sized companies is if the larger companies push down their expectations, but then still push down on expecting pricing to be exactly the same from their suppliers, for example. And if they're expecting their supply chain to improve their ES and G requirements, well, who's paying for that? And it's not necessarily an insignificant cost for the small and medium enterprises. And therefore, what we've seen is that certainly some of the larger manufacturers are partnering with their supply chain partners to help them lift up their policies, procedures, their remediation plans, etc., so that they are able to contribute to the ES and G requirements of the larger companies. But I think the worst thing that can happen is that the larger companies just push further down the supply chain, squeezing margin, because ultimately that's where there are going to be more issues, and ultimately that's where there are going to be more S problems and perhaps E problems, because you're trying to push enterprises who can't afford it to undertake standards that ordinarily they wouldn't be able to comply with.
Absolutely. I bank up on Andrew's thought on incorporation of the small scale and the medium scale industry within a larger ecosystem. And it is up to the large companies to, one, push, and second, pull. Both sides. It works both ways. Large companies have the willingness, have the bandwidth to pull the companies up on the ESG framework. At the same time, due to global requirement, it is also essential that some of the push also happens so that they can increase their bar in terms of the ESG governance. That ecosystem, once inbuilt into the system with the mix of pull and push, can easily help out on a lot of entities, including in agricultural market, where normally it's not there, but a lot of companies are into agriculture produces. Hence, this thing can definitely play a major role in agriculture market produce.
Right.
Just want to note just one trend that's particularly applicable to SMEs as well. When you have a lot of these ESG related laws, a lot of them have like a greenwashing component where they prohibit things like making unfounded claims about being environmentally friendly or ethically sourced. And so this also affects SMEs quite a bit, because like Andy said, they do get that pressure. So if you are part of an SME, just watch out for that in particular. There's going to be a temptation to engage in that sort of thing. Just understand that there are pretty strict laws against that we're seeing popping up around the region, and enforcement in that area is certainly increasing as the public has been demanding.
Great. It's also, I think, my 2 cents on this is also that you would find that companies need to think about creative ways that are not really very expensive for the SMEs. The example that we often give is, doing the third-party diligence on your vendors or high-risk vendors. And just to give you an example, in India, we find a lot of these are mom-and-pop shops, and you ask a company to do a third-party diligence on someone who's securing a customs permit or a tax license for you. Very high-risk activity from an FCPA perspective. That's going to be a partnership firm that may have been created 2 months before. You are going to get it squeaky clean if you tell them to go through an expensive third-party software that is going to check them against a US sanctions list or OFAC list and things like that, right? I mean, it's good money after bad that they are going to incur. So often we have taken a stance and we ask them to sort of think of ways in which local negative lists, at a cheaper cost can be accessed, and they can sort of prioritize that third-party diligence in a manner that is satisfactory, but it's very customized to the local requirement. It's not very expensive either. So, I agree. I think there are strategies that can be devised on, especially on the S and the G side, that can sort of be customized to suit the requirements of a supply chain. Small SMEs. We also have one more query from the audience. So, for the same geography that a business is in, you would have different checklists and requirements. And how does, let's say, if I'm running a business and I'm looking at potential investment, how do I go about what would your counsel be to me as a target investment? What is the most authoritative set of checklists and requirements do I go by? Because if these are going to vary, is there one standard that I can follow, or I should be benchmarking myself against? How does it work for me as a potential target for investment?
I'm happy to take that one. Certainly, as we've been saying throughout the presentation, across the world, there are different standards. There are different regulations, and there are different environments in which those regulations are being implemented. So there is no one size fits all, and there is no single checklist that anyone could go by. Wouldn't it be a great world if that were the case? But that's not the case, and it'll never be the case. So the best thing that we can do is really do everything on a risk assessment basis. If you are an investor, you need to look at what where all of the different manufacturing facilities may be, what the different regulations are across multiple geographies, and to protect yourself and to protect your investment and for the company to protect itself, it is likely to be best to define the highest threshold across the company's business and develop compliance policies and a program that satisfies the highest threshold in any particular set of regulatory requirements. Then you can grow comfort from the fact that you have a single cohesive policy around the world that will meet the right standard no matter where you are.
All right. Let me change gears. In terms of the remediation, is an assessment of the, I'm assuming that on the governance side, assessment of the integrity program, the general, resources that are allocated to, assessment or remediation of any whistleblower hotlines or any concerns, any control weaknesses is essential. Are we seeing an emergence of a chief integrity officer or a chief sustainability officer as a result of ESG diligences? And if so, what are the things that you would look at, to ensure that this is, this is not just lip service, this is an effective position with, credible resources attached to them? Anyone on the panel?
What I am seeing is two things from the investment community. One is specific compliance and or legal team members who are targeting ESG as their requirements. Clearly, ESG is very broad, but more and more of the investment community are looking at this area because of the very issues that we've been talking about. And so compliance or legal or wherever it fits within the function are hiring people specifically in this area. I would also note that you can't move at the moment for law firms and accounting firms and other consultants touting ESG and their ESG credentials. And so I think that will also flow down into the CIO and the CSO that you're talking about. I'm not seeing myself a significant push to hire CIO and CSO right now. I could see that happening in the future, but I think there is a difference, obviously, between the multinational companies, strategics, and the investing asset managers. But they are starting to focus on this area internally and devoting resource to it. There will then be competition for those very people, and it'll be harder and harder to hire good quality people, which we have seen in the compliance legal community generally, depending on what is flavor of the month for the regulator or the investment community.
Great. In terms of the overall, especially the architecture of audits and, post-investment assessments, what are investors looking at? Let's start with maybe the funds that are very active in doing ESG diligences. How often do they want the audits, and what kind of visibility are they looking at post-investment? Bill, let me start with you and then go around the panel.
It's often a function of how much scrutiny they themselves are under. To be quite candid about it, I think there's a direct relationship between whether a fund is going through one of these exams, for example, in the United States that the SEC is conducting, or how in front of the ESG movement they've been. If they've been a thought leader in this space, then their expectations are going to necessarily be different than another fund who may not be situated in that way. But I think the more ESG is treated like other financial metrics, the better it is for the company, and the more assurance that will give investors and business partners who are focused on this issue. So, if it's part of the internal audit plan, if there are in fact measurable milestones. I mean, the great temptation around ESG is to have very aspirational, squishy language that doesn't really amount to very much. And I think people have gotten wise to that. And if you do make very broad sweeping statements, that's still no guarantee that you're insulated, right? People are still going to be asking hard questions about what this means. Well, is this in your risk register? Who in the audit, who in the board, at what board level is this in the audit committee who has oversight of this? Who owns the ESG function? Going back to the question you talked about earlier, and what's their training or qualification around these issues? So I think it varies, but there are some constants, and I think the one prudent course that we recommend to our clients, and I think this is probably an emerging consensus, is treat ESG like you would other risk factors, like you would other material risk factors.
Very interesting. So at the very minimum, you will expect investors to be doing an annual exercise, but you will expect them to do probably not necessarily on a quarterly basis, but on a half-yearly basis.
Yeah, at least as frequently as you are other aspects of the program, and certainly no less than annually. Particularly in this space, because it is so dynamic and things keep changing and evolving, right? I mean, we're at a very unusual inflection point in the direction this is all going. So standards are still coalescing, but there is concrete guidance out there, right? The EU has been ahead of this curve for a bit now, and so the prudent thing is to stay current, and that means refreshing, maybe in the short term, more frequently than you would otherwise.
All right, Sheila, is that in the Middle East region or the investments that you are working on? What is the expectation of the investors, and how often do they want reporting on ESG issues post-investment from target companies?
Generally speaking, I think the Middle East and Africa is taking leads from Europe and the United States. A lot of investment in this part of the world is coming from outside this part of the world. So we are, in terms of companies here, learning from what others are doing and adopting and coalescing our own standards. Certainly funds, and there are some that are uniquely focused on ESG alone. And those funds that have ESG as their portfolio are the ones who I think are going to be driving this, because like we talked about at the beginning, what they look for and what they will do will set the standard, I think, for other funds that don't have an ESG focus, but for which ESG is simply a component like others.
Got it. We are going to be 2 minutes away, but let me go around the panel and throw a curveball for everyone. Very quickly, top 2 things that you would tell a client to be watching out for in the ESG space. So let's maybe start with Oliver. Oliver, what top 2 things, top 2 trends that you're going to be watching out for in the ESG space in the times to come? Bit of a future speak, but what are your views?
Yes, the first thing I would say, watching out in the ESG space is really first of all, look inward and look and see what your own risks are. I mean, a lot of the panelists have talked about, biting off more than you can chew and trying to do much more than your risk profile calls for. So first of all, look inwardly and do an internal risk assessment. Be very honest with yourself as to what your risks are and how you can mitigate those in the short term. And then the last thing is keep up to date, not only on legal developments, but on societal norms. Look and see what's going on in the media, in the news, see what people care about, because what people care about as far as social issues soon becomes laws, soon becomes obligations on companies. And the sooner you can get out in front of that, the better.
Thank you. Very quickly, Andy, your top 2 things to watch out for.
I think somewhat similar to Oliver. I think watching the NGO space in this area, it's a really good indicator for what's heading your way. And also, I think watching the regulators, I think Bill, talked about this earlier. Where is their focus going to be? Because you want to be there ahead of them, because if they come knocking and you're not ready, then you're going to have problems, I think.
Interesting. Bill?
Take a look at the EU framework. It's probably the most coherent, comprehensive guidance I've seen out there. It's certainly light years ahead of where the US is right now. And that, I think, will be a template that others will look to. And certainly that's got driving diligence issues for funds right now, because that's a framework that they're governed by. If they do business in the United States, they're going to end up doing business in Europe. The other point, and stepping and leveraging off of what both Oliver and Andy talked about, I would say look at the NGOs, look at the Sovereign Wealth Fund for Norway, look at the Scottish Widows Pensions Fund. They've been real thought leaders in this space, and look at why they've delisted or blacklisted companies. And just take a look at the type of conduct that has triggered that reaction by them. And that gives you a sense of what the parameters are and what the triggers are for investment in this space.
Sheila, your top 2 items?
Sure. The first would be to develop a global framework that's flexible enough to be implemented locally across different geographies. The second would be to not underestimate the economic power of the consumer today. Sometimes I think more powerful than the regulator. And I'm going to sneak in a third. Companies that are looking for some framework should really look at the 2005-2006 UN Principles for Responsible Investment. I think it's a very nice way to frame all of the issues and give companies and investors a framework to start looking at when they're thinking about these issues.
Great. And Ankit, you have the last word. Top 2 trends in ESG that you recommend watching out for.
Watch out for social license to operate, which will be the determining factor and it considers both the global and the local economies. That will keep changing over a period of time. That's point number 1. And as far as the point number 2 is considered, watch out for European Union, which has already been pointed out very well. Looks like that's going to be the mother legislation for most of the countries to follow through.
Great. Look, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but we could go on this panel. It's been lovely to have all of you join in from different corners of the world. Thank you very much, and I hope the audience find it useful. And thank you, Vicky, for having us.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you to all the panelists. And Vicky would like to be in touch with all of you to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kunal, for hosting us. Thank you, Vicky.
Everybody.
Bye.
रहने दो फिर कोशिश बिगड़ेगा live now.
We now bring to you the last session of FICCI's two-day ESG Summit. This session on stakeholder management, reporting and responsiveness will provide answers to most of the questions that we have been receiving since yesterday on the chat box. I am pleased to welcome our esteemed panelists. We have with us Dr. Arvind Budhankar, Executive Director ESG and Chief Risk Officer, Dalmia Cement Limited. Mr. Gaurang Chandrana, Head ESG Operations, ESGRisk.ai. Dr. Karan Thakur, Vice President, Project and Public Affairs, Apollo Hospitals Enterprises Limited. And Mr. Willem Jain, Co-Chair, FICCI Environment Committee and Executive Director, Supply Chain, Hindustan Unilever Limited. The session is chaired and moderated by Mr. Shankar Venkateshwaran, Operating Partner and Head, ESG, eCube Investment Advisors. The floor is all yours, Shankar.
Thank you, Abha, and good morning, friends. Really delighted to have such a distinguished and erudite panel today. Makes my job easier because I'm just going to leave it to them to give us the insights. They are the ones on the ground. They are the ones who engage with stakeholders. So the insights that we're going to get from them are going to be invaluable. So I'm going to fade into the background after making just a few opening remarks to sort of set the context to this session. So the session is on stakeholder management. And I think this is a very important term to sort of understand and absorb as companies are beginning to do that more and more. I mean, for the longest time, when companies talked about, or when the term stakeholder was talked about in a company, it was very often the investor, not even the retail investor, the institutional investor. And everything sort of revolved around that, and that wasn't surprising because, in a sense, it was a sort of a continuation of the Milton Friedman sort of way of looking at business. But I think what has changed, and this has changed dramatically in the last few decades, more so in the last decade, that there has been a more wider understanding of how companies operate and who they are accountable to and who are important to them. And so the idea of stakeholders has taken real root. And I think one of the most interesting sort of developments that cements this sort of holistic understanding of a stakeholder is what happened in 2019 at the Business Roundtable in the US, which up until then used to talk about shareholder centricity. And then on that, which was almost the 50th year of Milton Friedman's famous article in the New York Times, they talked about the fact that companies have to be and are accountable to a larger set of stakeholders. And specifically, they talked about customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. So that was the way the Business Roundtable spoke about it. So they really unpacked all the stakeholders. Investors also had been going down this path for some time, and I've been looking at it from investors tend to look at it from a risk opportunities lens, as you would expect, and folks like Larry Fink of BlackRock also spoke in the same language and talked about it, and also talked about greater accountability and greater reporting by companies to a larger context. So I think it's now very clear that very few companies, while you might have a hierarchy of stakeholders, companies still might sort of listen more closely to what investors are saying or what regulators are saying or what customers are saying, the three principal external stakeholders. I think there is greater and greater understanding that suppliers matter, your own employees matter, and there are enough and more evidence that demonstrates that this actually makes business sense to do it. So companies are doing it as you would expect because it's a rational thing to do, and therefore that's sort of happening. And in this context is where reporting or disclosures has a very central role to play, because disclosures in the old days, when you were only looking at your shareholder, the disclosures was mainly financial. Moment you started expanding it to beyond the shareholder to other stakeholders, you had the growth of non-financial or sustainability reporting that started to come about. And so a lot more parameters came into the fold and a lot more disclosures started happening. And I think one of the interesting trends, and I'm hoping that we would tease that out from our panelists today, is where is the disclosure process headed? So, for example, is it how is it fit for purpose for a wider range of stakeholders? The growth of mandatory reporting as opposed to voluntary reporting, and so there are some very, very interesting trends that are visible clearly around the fact that companies need to respond to stakeholders. So that's the sort of broad context in which we're going to have this sort of a conversation. And so again, I'm now going to go to our panelists to tease out some of these issues. So I'm going to start with Gaurang Chandrana. So Gaurang, you are a provider of ESG ratings, so which means that you are very data centered. You're getting information from a lot of places, right. But I presume that's because you're getting demand from companies. That companies are saying, I need this information in order to be able to engage with stakeholders. So what is the trends that you're seeing? Who are the kind of stakeholders that your client companies are focusing on? What are the kind of expectations are you seeing from these stakeholders of company behavior? And how has this been changing over time? So Gaurang, if you could give us that big picture from your perspective, that would be a good starting point for this. Over to you.
Thank you, Shankar, all the panelists, esteemed panelists out here, and all the audience. You've set the stage very well, Shankar, for this entire subject. Stakeholders have evolved, or the nature of stakeholders over time, and in just as less as over a year since all of us started this ESG journey. Today, we are talking about, as you rightly put in, customers, employees, society at large, absolutely, of course, investors and regulators. I would like to add one more over here from an Indian perspective, and I'm seeing this big trend. The company itself is now treating itself as a stakeholder. A lot of demand has been driven by organizations saying, we want to make a genuine change, not because my investor is asking or a regulator is asking. And I also see that in the unlisted space, since we do both kinds of assessments. And we are getting requirements for more and more granular level data to be given out to satisfy stakeholders. There are a couple of other issues over here. One is the stage of the journey of an organization also depends on what they are looking at. And therefore, they focus on a certain stakeholder. If a company is just starting a sustainability journey or trying to raise monies to turn around its plant or get into carbon credits, etc., they are going to be more the traditional investor focused. And they will focus more on disclosures and improving the disclosure quality. We also help them track that, and they come back to us saying that, okay, what are the kinds of disclosures which an investor will accept or a regulator will accept? That's the second change we've seen. Third change is a slight deviation in terms of the nature of business. Manufacturing concerns will tend to focus more on society, employee safety, product safety, which is your customers, employee, and society, because the impact is huge. Whereas the service sector will be focused on employee development, data security, etc. But all in all, due to impact investing and investor activism, which is rapidly increased all over the world, actually all are interlinked. We cannot delink any of these. Today, any one impact in one area impacts all stakeholders. We cannot say something has gone wrong, however minor, with an employee in the safety front. It just gets blown out, whether it's social media or the press. And an investor will come back asking a question, or a regulator will put in an audit. So we cannot really avoid any of this at all. And the last point I would like to make is there are three stakeholders who will come into the picture very rapidly, and we are not looking at all. Our kids below 12. A whole lot of purchase decisions are driven by them when we talk about gaming, etc., and the impact it's having. We need to look at that. Second stakeholder is the youth, who have their own set of challenges, and this is a big community at a global level. Third most important one we are ignoring are women investors. The latest research shows only 1% of women investors are into angel investing or PE or that side. I think more and more of them will come in, and when they come in, they will get their own set of questions to push companies onto the ESG side. Yeah, over to you, Shankar.
Thanks, Gaurav. Very, very interesting. So a couple of variables you identified. So one is the stage in which the company is. I think that's an important one. And in terms of the journey of sustainability. So that's a very good insight. You also talked about the fact that you have these emerging new types, and these are potentially customers, they are potentially employees, young people, kids, and so on, who are far more conscious about some of these sustainability issues than we have. So very, very interesting, and regulators obviously need to be part of that whole. Now, I think you also made an interesting distinction between manufacturing and service, and we are very fortunate also in this panel to have two from the manufacturing sector and one from the services sector. So I know that's going to give us a good segue into getting some of those insights. But I'm now going to go to Arvind from Dalmia, and cement is one of those toughies, right? Because you need cement. It's part of all infrastructure, at least for the foreseeable future. It's hard to abate in terms of climate, from a climate perspective. It is manufacturing. There is lots of complexities with the whole process itself. So how do stakeholders figure in your scheme of things? Which are the big ones that you focus on, given the business that you're in, and how do you sort of engage with them on this whole journey in terms of understanding what their expectations are of you? How do you fulfill some of those expectations? That whole stakeholder management piece for a cement company seems quite complex, and it'll be interesting to hear from you who the big ones are and how you deal with that. Arvind.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Abha. Thank you, Fiki, for giving me this opportunity. Shankar, you rightly said that cement is, a very much essential component of the economy. And if you look at the trends of the Indian economy, or the aspiration what we are going to have, we want to be a 5 trillion economy by 2025. Government has a very ambitious program on housing for all, and government has already sanctioned for 114 crores of housing under the PM Awas Yojana. If you look at the recent budget also post-COVID, and government has earmarked about 1.47 lakh crores for the infrastructure development. Now, all this will, put a pressure on the cement industry to actually deliver. And if you look at the all these projects or the investment government is making, cement industry would require, will have to produce about 850 million tons of cement, and that will lead to about 12% growth on year basis. Uh, Definitely. So coming to the stakeholders, if you look at this thing, so government is a major stakeholder, and they want you to produce more and more cement, quality cement, and at the same time at the right price, because all this is going for the development of the country and affordable housing. So there is always a pressure from the government side, to control the prices. Similarly, the second cement industry is the second largest industry, which cement industry is the Indian cement industry is the second largest industry, and cement is the material, second largest material being consumed after water. So a lot of raw material is consumed in producing cement. A lot of mining activity we do. While in circular economy also we are a leader, but definitely cement industry consumes a lot of raw material. So there is a pressure from community and civil society also that not all the resources are for you. So, you need to really come out with the true value of your product, what we are doing, and make sure that your growth is really a kind of inclusive growth, and the community is also growing along with you. So there are lots of expectation from the community also. When I talked about the growth, 12% growth, this growth cannot happen without investment. And while many of the cement industry are cash rich and debt free balance sheet, but still for the growth which we are anticipating today, our consumption per capita is just about 216 kgs per capita as compared to the 550 in the developed countries. So we have a gap of about 300 tons. And to bridge that gap of 300 ton, a lot of investment will be required. Now, this investment will come from the domestic investor and will also come from the FI. If you look at the FI activity last year, in spite of COVID, we had about 5.8 to $6 billion being invested into cement industry. And many of the cement industry are featuring into the top 100, top 200 in the SEBI listing. If you look at the stock exchanges, what we talked about. So investor is definitely one of the key stakeholders, and their expectation we know very well where they come from, because cement industry contributes about 7 to 8% to the CO2 pool, and they think that this is a culprit industry or offender. So there is a huge pressure on climate change on the cement industry. And the fourth one, and I would say the equally important one is the regulators, because you may expect carbon tax coming up, you may expect carbon market coming up. So those kind of things, while traditionally we could have had 7 or 8 stakeholders, but these are the top 4, I would say. The people means when we say internal people, and the external, that is community, government, investors, and regulators. Coming to the disclosure also, you slightly mentioned about cement industry is doing a lot as far as disclosure is concerned. We are way ahead to the other sectors, whether it is metal sector or the mining sector or other. Most of the cement industry have committed to science-based target. Most of the cement industry has committed for carbon neutrality roadmap. Most of the cement industries have been publishing the GRI reports or the integrated reports based on various, whatever standard it is. My own company, if I have to talk about stakeholder engagement, we have a very robust policy and framework for stakeholder engagement, and we use various tools. We organize event through emails, through materiality assessment, through interviews, and all. We do engage with them, understand their issues, and try to fulfill those issues. My own company, Dalmia Bharat Limited, was the first one to report on BRSR. In fact, we did it last year, while the mandate is for 22-23. But we did it for 2021, the first year itself. There is a lot of scope for improvement in this area. But this will be second year, and of course next year onward it will be mandatory. We have been complying to almost every disclosure, whether it is GRI, we publish integrated reports, CDP, all those kind of disclosures we do. So let me take a pause over here and maybe park my thoughts for the later Q&A.
Yeah, sure. And we would also hope that we would have questions and comments from the people who are participants in this, and I'm sure that so this is a request to everyone else who's listening into this this panel discussion. Please put in your questions, comments to each of the panelists, and we'll take them up. Other panelists, and we'll go first round of questions with them. Yeah, so thank you, Arvind. So very clear, 4 big ones that you've identified. Government in terms of an expectation, because you're in the cement industry, and government's own plans for infrastructure, communities, investors, and regulators. So those are the big 3 or 4. So we'll talk about the reporting piece a little bit more in the next round of questions in terms of how that's working out for you. But I just wanted to go across to Willem now. Willem, you handle supply chains for HUL, and and supply chains is one of those 4 that the roundtable business roundtable talked about. But it's the one that's least sort of understood in terms of how to engage with suppliers, because it is not easy. Your tier 1 suppliers are easy, but what happens after that is usually not many companies have line of sight of that, and I don't know how many of them make an attempt to do that. But HUL clearly has, and I think it'll be interesting to give us a perspective in terms of how the whole supply chain fits into the your larger sustainable living plan. I mean, the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan is, of course, well known, and I know that supply chains figure in it, but just join the dots for us in terms of how did you think of a company that's like critical, and how is that engagement happening in your scheme of things? Willem, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Shankar, and welcome everybody. I thought the point that Gwanang was making before on the stakeholders, I particularly liked the stakeholders there, the kids of 12 years and below. I think if I answer the question on suppliers, it actually comes back to the different generations that are there and how they look at sustainability, because it starts from the consumer point of view. And I think if you look at the older generations, the baby boomers, for example, people 60 to 80 years old, you see that the care for sustainability, or ESG, is, and I use averages here, but it's not a big theme. And you go one generation further, and you suddenly see that there is care for sustainability, but that generation of consumers, that 40 to 55 or 40 to 60, at the moment that choices need to be made for what kind of products you buy, you see that it doesn't really play. So there is a say variant, but the do is not really there. The next generation, Generation Y, you clearly see that the care is there in the saying what they do, but they don't want to pay more for it yet. So I'd love to have a product that is more sustainable, but it should come at the same quality and the same cost as a product that is less sustainable. Now, the Generation Z that we have, the people that 20 to 30 or 20 to 35, you see that now coming up, that they're willing to pay more for sustainable products, and also do some compromises on quality. And I can only imagine, because I have kids myself that are of the age that Gwanang was talking about, and with what they make me do, at least in pay for the things that I buy for them, that cost and that quality element is even less pronounced than you see with Generation Z. So there's clearly in the different generations a difference coming through in how important they see that sustainability as an overall concept is of importance for the choices that they make as consumers. Now, if I then look at what sustainability is all about, and I know that for different companies that is different things, but if I look at sustainability within Unilever, then we have specific actions on climate, There are specific actions on protecting and regenerating nature. There's a whole program on what we do to come to a waste-free world. There is actions that we have on improving people's health, confidence, and well-being. So the nutrition that we have for the health and well-being of consumers, as well as contributing to a fairer and more socially inclusive world that is about raising living standards. So it has a very broad range of activities. Now, in any one of those, if I look at the impact that you want to make in your end-to-end value chain, you can't do that without involving your suppliers. And let me try to do that with one example. If I look at, for example, the greenhouse gas footprint that we have for our products, because we do publish the greenhouse gas footprint that we have in the end-to-end value chain for scope 1, 2, and 3 for the majority of our products. Now, if you look at that footprint, then the operations that we manage ourselves, so let's say our factories, offices, distribution centers, they make up about 7% of the greenhouse gas emissions that you have for a product overall. About 60% of the greenhouse gases actually come from the sourcing of your raw materials. And that's raw materials, the ingredients that are being used for the manufacturing of our products and the packaging materials that are there. And then some 30% comes in the consumer use, that is, and the retail space where product gets sold. The majority sits actually in the consumer use itself, when you heat up water, for example, for cooking your food, or your shower, the water or the heated water that you would use for taking a shower, as well as the end-of-life disposal of products. So what I'm trying to say is that if you look at the greenhouse gas footprint, the majority sits on the back end of the supply chain, or the front end of the value chain in the consumer use or in the usage of materials, the production of materials. Now, that means you need to involve your stakeholders and your customers and your consumers, as well as your suppliers, if you want to tackle the full footprint of greenhouse gases across scope 1, 2, and 3. Now, I do believe that if you want to talk about scope 3, and you want to go with your suppliers and say, listen, we have an objective of reducing our overall greenhouse gas footprint. If you don't have your own house in order, it is very difficult to talk with suppliers and agree there what it is that they would need to do if you don't have your own house in order yet. So I do believe that although the greenhouse gases that we have in our own operations is a relatively small part, you could argue, of the totality of the value chain, we first have a job to do to make sure that in our own factories, in our own distribution, we bring down the greenhouse gas emissions. That will also teach us, and that does teach us, for what are the things that really work and what are the things that don't work. So we see, for example, that in greenhouse gas emissions, in HUL specifically now, we have moved to 100% renewable energy, if that concerns electricity in India. And we see as well that the majority that we now have of heat generation is coming from renewable sources, where we have moved out of coal previously, and we're moving into biomass very quickly for the generation of heat. Now, what that is helping us with is that it established the methodologies as well that we can replicate with our suppliers, to replicate in their own operations, because many of our suppliers have similar operations as we have for the manufacturing or the distribution of our goods. And that really helps us to establish these methodologies and replicate them with our suppliers. Now, there's two things important there, is that you need to have a certain credibility when you go with your partners to say, listen, we've tried this ourselves, it did work, this is something that you could replicate as well. And you have no credibility either if you just ask your suppliers to do this, but you didn't do it yourself. So I believe that, that there is a definitive need for it if you look at the carbon footprint that is out there, but you can only move with your suppliers upstream the value chain, or with your customers and your consumers downstream, if you're forced to put your own house in order.
Great. So thanks. I think that's a very interesting sort of linkage that you've drawn, right, from how the customer, what the customer as a stakeholder is expecting of a company like yours, and then how do you fulfill that expectation? And you can't do it unless you get your supply chains to be part of that whole process, and you're going to walk the talk. You can't just be talking to supply chains. You're going to first walk and then talk to them about getting into that. So that's a sort of a very holistic way of looking at it, and that involves understanding life cycles, doing life cycle analysis, figuring out where where the hotspots lie and then sort of addressing it. So very, very helpful. And now we'll in the next sort of round of discussion, we'll come to the role that reporting and disclosures play in all this. So we'll come back to you, Willem, on that. Meanwhile, I just wanted to get Karan in to this discussion. And I think, to lead off from what Gaurang kicked us off with, the differences between the manufacturing and the services sector. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to us from a health services company. How do you look at stakeholders? Who are your major ones? How do you engage with them? And that itself will tease out some of the differences between, say, how a Dalmia or a HUL, what are the key stakeholders for them and what's the key stakeholders for you? So Karan, a bit of information on how you look at stakeholders and how you engage with them.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you, Vicky, for having me. So as has been outlined previously, in our stakeholder management exercise that we look at, it is quite obvious that patients are really central to what we do and why we exist. And around that is the entire gamut of quality of services and outcomes, which are fair expectations that our patients and their families have of us. So primarily the major stakeholder is the patient and the ecosystem around the patient, i.e. the services and the outcomes that we do. And providing these services is the wide and very varied workforce that we have, right from a super specialist doctor who's probably the best in the world in his or her field of expertise, down to the frontline staff, which may be on the minimum wage, but is a very important cog in the delivery of services and ensuring quality outcomes. So how we manage, the expectations of that very diverse workforce, which is ensuring that, our primary stakeholder, the patient and their families, are given quality health services becomes very important. The other slightly tricky aspect about healthcare and delivery of healthcare is that it straddles the world of high expectations from a social philosophy of health for all, and that free health for all, and the investor interest in making sure that there is growth, there is expansion of services, expansion of infrastructure, and a wider reach of quality health services to an even wider spectrum of Indian citizens and global citizens. So we straddle that, that those expectations frameworks from civil society and from governments on one side and investors on the other. And obviously, when we operate, our hospitals are generating a lot of ecologically and environmentally, sensitive materials. For example, waste management, biomedical waste management. If I could focus on, we are the largest producers of biomedical waste in the country. Now that puts us in a position of a lot of responsibility to ensure how do we dispose of it, how do we collect it, and what is the end treatment of biomedical waste in its entire cycle of being generated and then being moved out through our vendors and then sustainably disposed of. So that is a big challenge for us, and we've seen in the past 2 years with COVID-19, the generation of biomedical waste and hazardous waste has gone up by some estimates to double of what it was pre-pandemic, and that makes us even more aware of the challenges that is going to pose in the years ahead. Along with this has been the challenge of single-use plastics. Typically, we see disposables being a mainstay of the delivery of care, whether it is plastics of various natures, could be injections, syringes, or other types of materials that we use, but are primarily disposable or single-use. Now that footprint, and again, the entire life cycle, both from the value side and the supply chain side, is something that we've laid a lot of emphasis on. And we feel that going forward, that is something where we need to work with our suppliers to see how we can ensure safe, products come for patient care, but are also sustainable. And we've divided that into two. One is on the non-clinical single-use plastics that we are using, and then is the clinical single-use plastics, because their importance is quite different when you look at both of them. Lastly is privacy and cyber security. Healthcare is usually a target of a lot of cyber security issues, hacking, data mining, even stealing of data, and the entire spectrum of healthcare services and our responsibility towards our primary stakeholder, the patients, rests on how secure we can keep his or her data. And as we expand our footprint between public and private sector, you would have recently heard about the National Digital Health Mission, where interoperability of patient records and patient data is going to become more and more in vogue. How do we ensure the security of a patient's data and ensure that it is transmitted or shared in a responsible way are going to be areas of concern that we are addressing today, but we foresee challenges in the years ahead as well.
Fantastic, Karan. I think that was very, very helpful. A lot of things that for you which seems obvious, I think for somebody like me who's been working in this space were actually very insightful. So thank you for that. I mean, we all knew that patients are central and all the providers of care are central, but I think the other challenges that you pointed out, including data security, which of course Gaurav also made a reference to in the beginning, are, I think, very, very critical elements of it. And we'll just come to how this engagement happens with these stakeholders in a minute, and the role that reporting plays. So I do see that there are some questions in the chat box, so we will address that. I just want to bring into the conversation the role that reporting plays in the stakeholder management piece, and then we'll come back to the questions that are in the chat box. So let me start with you, Bill. I think we got a very good insight into how one needs to engage with stakeholders, and I think a lot of the engagement is pretty much on an ongoing basis, right? Because there's a transactional relationship also that happens. But I'm just wondering how does it work when it comes to ESG sustainability issues? What mechanism handling stakeholders? Because you did mention that you walk the talk. You did mention, of course, you walk the talk, but I'm wondering what is the way that
I think we are losing.
Oh, I see. Okay, is this better?
Yes, you're better.
Yes.
Yeah. So sorry. So Willem, I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit in terms of the engagement that you have with the stakeholders, with the supply chain particularly, and what role that reporting plays in that engagement. That sustainability reporting plays in that engagement. If you could just talk to us a bit about that, Willem.
Right. Okay. Pleasure to do so. I think in reporting, I need to explain a little bit then that for Unilever, the vision of the company really is to make sustainable living commonplace. So sustainability really sits at the core of the vision and the strategy of the company. That also means that when we look at how we want to grow as a company, we look at that what we call a 4G growth model. It means that we're looking at growth that needs to be a consistent growth. So let's say the top line growth that you have as a company. It needs to be profitable growth. It needs to be competitive growth, which, let's say, share of the pie you would have of your market, which are, I think, the three traditional elements outside of cash and so on that companies would always look at for how they are performing and would be reporting upon as well. The 4G that we have in there as Unilever is to have responsible growth, and that goes all around the objectives that I mentioned before. But if I capture that all in the sustainability objectives that we have as a company, we really see that as a central part of the vision of Unilever, and therefore in reporting, we obviously report on the consistency of growth, the profitability of growth, and the competitiveness that we have of our growth. But if you see that 4G growth model, it also means that in responsible growth, you have that same responsibility to report on it. And the reason why I believe that that reporting is so important, the first thing that happens with reporting is that in order to do your reporting, you need to measure. And anything that you measure, you can start to improve upon. So that measurement is really driving a continuous improvement agenda. If you don't measure for yourself in your own operations, it becomes very difficult to improve. And that same goes for the suppliers that you were asking me about. I think the second thing that it does is that if you have the reporting in place, it provides visibility. And that visibility leads to trust or credibility on the actions that you take as a company. And obviously, if that visibility is there, it drives further action as well, because there will be a larger group of stakeholders involved with comments and requests on what you do as a company, not just in your own operations, but with your suppliers as well. So I clearly see that the reporting that needs to be in place as a company, but also in your end-to-end value chain, is driving that improvement and is driving that visibility and trust in what you do as a company. Now, if you have sustainability at the core of the vision of your company, without that trust in what you're doing from your consumers, from the NGOs, from governments, and from your suppliers, it becomes very difficult to have that as a credible vision for the company. So reporting there is an essential part, I would say, as is the reporting of growth numbers or competitiveness or profitability of a company. Now, we have that reporting as well in place in the different frameworks, if that is in GRI or in UNGC. We have CDP, for example, the Carbon Disclosure Project that is there in the TCFD. This is a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. We're part of all of these frameworks to do the reporting on what we do in our own operations, and we work together there as well with our suppliers to get that in place. Under Shankar, I have to say the same principles, that we try to do this as extensive as possible as we can do that for our own operations first, and then move the parts that are really working well and where we have it well established to our suppliers as well. Now, further upstream in the value chain as well towards our customers, or even part with our consumers. But the parts that we have been able to implement well in our own operations, we're moving forward with our suppliers as well. And why that is important, I think, comes back to the same explanation that I had before. If you look at not just the greenhouse gas footprint that I explained earlier, that the majority actually sits with our suppliers, but also if you look at water consumption, for example, a big part of the waste generation. In the end, I heard before as well from Karan the talk on plastics, which I found very interesting. Now, of course, as HUL, because of the usage of the materials that we have in our packaging, we have a large plastic footprint. Now, we work on that ourselves, where we, for example, last year collected more than our total footprint of 115,000 tons of plastics in all of the states and union territories in India. It's one example where we first put our own house in order, such to say, but now we're looking at how can we work with our suppliers who are in the end making that packaging material as well, that they pick up their own part in the plastic program, in that EPR program, in making our plastics recyclable, in reducing the amount of plastics that we have, or in finding us alternative materials to plastics. But again, if you want to work with innovation and the reporting there with your suppliers on these topics, I find it extremely important that you first have your own house in order. So yes, extremely important, that reporting, because the majority of the footprint for many of the indicators that go around sustainability sits in our supplier base. But you can't do that without first putting your own house in order, as I said.
So that's a theme that is consistent, right? You first have to make sure you do it before you ask anywhere else in the value chain to do it. But I think it's also interesting that you talk about it being virtuous cycle, right? When you start reporting, put it out in the public domain, it starts that whole process of self-improvement in any case. It drives that process. So that becomes a very virtuous cycle. So yeah, thanks, William. So Arvind, if I can come to you, and a similar question to you, Karan, after Arvind, is, you talked about the multiple reporting that you do. You said you started with BRSR, and there is a question in the chat on the BRSR, but you do integrated reporting, GRI. Now, which of these, why do you do all of these reports? And which of them are most important for which of your, for 3 or 4 major stakeholders? And how do you communicate them? I'm especially intrigued with how you communicate to communities, because communities are not going to be able to understand a GRI report. So I'm just wondering, how do you use that, so which report works best for which of your big stakeholders, and how do you communicate it across? So that, and Karan, a similar question to you after that.
Shankar, very interesting.
We'll ask you to wrap it up for us at the end.
A very, very interesting one, and that struggle we always have. There are 11, 12 rating agencies, ESG rating agencies. Few says that DJSI is something best. Few says, Sustainalytics is good. The few ones say Refinitiv is best, and all those kind of things are there. The few says MSCI is good, and they have different expectations. What we try to do is primarily there are 2 reports internationally. If you see the GRI standards, and the second one is the integrated reporting standard. And there was a lot of debate between whether we should have integrated reporting or a GRI, both. Or both. So what we have tried to produce a kind of, the expectations of all these agencies or all these, frameworks which are there, and try to put it in a integrated reporting format. While value creation will be our focus, what value we are offering to the stakeholders, and that has to be communicated. So one is efforts, one is availability of the resources you have, and the other one is the tool through which you want to communicate. And so we have chosen the integrated report, could be perhaps some of the best. Of course, this kept on varying with the companies I work. Few companies thought that, GRI is more to for the non-financial reporting, and IR is only limited to 6 capitals and all. And we don't get much of the room to communicate the value which we have created. But both have their merits and demerits, and largely we have narrowed down on IR, which is a kind of concise report, but at the same time exactly directing to the expectations of the stakeholders. So that's one internationally. But definitely BRSR, and we all of us have been a part of that consultation networks which we had, and it's also coming out to be very good, at par with all these frameworks, international frameworks. So we thought that this will more address to the domestic stakeholders, and we will communicate with that. Your question about how do you directly communicate with the stakeholders? So of course, this reports what we had seen, and all of us will agree, largely these have been seen by the investors, and some of the prospective the employees who would like to join. They refer your reports, and the investors and some of the academicians, they do refer to this report. So we always keep on referring, checking how many of them have actually visited our website and downloaded the report. And that number never went around more than 200 or 300. But that's the kind of audience we were not looking for. So we have, as I said during my response to your first question, we have a stakeholder engagement policy, and we do directly interact with them. While this is one tool, those whosoever wants to, but we also proactively engage with stakeholders through various tools, may it be investors forum, may it be community engagement, may it be through some of the events, or email exchanges, interviews, or some communication through various channels in the public domain. So we keep on trying to engage with the stakeholders and communicate the value what we are creating for them. So we are not limited to only the reports which are there. So all sort of tools which are available, we are trying to utilize those tools to communicate.
Okay, so reporting is a necessary part of the communication, but it's not the only thing, and
It's
you
not the
have to look
only
for
thing.
other forums to do that. Karan, similar question to you. What are the kind of reporting you do, and how does that, I mean, especially patients, for example, I'm sure they don't read a GRI report. So how does reporting fit into this engagement process for you?
Right. I'd echo what Dr. Arvind said about the mandatory reporting, as it were. Whether it is a BSR, SR, or whether it is, sustainability reports that are coming out, which we also do as an organization. Pretty much echo the views that Dr. Arvind has said. But specifically for patients, one is, we're very keenly focused on patient family education and rights. I think, communicating transparently to patients what they should expect of a procedure, of a medical treatment, what are the risks, what are the likely outcomes, what are the likely risks that one would have for the long term is very important. The second is, patient family rights. I think that is also very important because given the paternalistic attitudes that healthcare has traditionally been accused of, there is a lot more interest now amongst our patient base on understanding what their rights are. So, putting that information out there very transparently, giving it to patients prior to their procedures or prior to even their admission during or after their first consultation, in their hands, in their local languages, helps in communicating that value to the patients and also for them to understand their rights. The other is on the outcomes framework, and that is where we have worked extensively to create a framework on the outcomes that we would like and where we are. And these are benchmarked against the best centers in the world. So, for example, on our CABG, which is your bypass surgery, we're benchmarking ourselves with Cleveland Clinic, and all our hospitals are rated, and we put it out there for our patients to see. The last aspect of transparency is basically pricing, which has been a very sensitive issue for our key stakeholder, both patients and for governments and civil society organizations. And we have put it out there on our website, and we do have an estimation desk in each of our hospitals where each procedure or each health intervention is explained to our patients, so that there is that transparency and ethical conduct that we are trying to ensure our patients fully understand.
Thank you. So it is again, as Arvind said, reporting is just one part of it. There's a lot of other stuff that you need to do to get that communication going. So Gaurang, we sort of coming to the end, and I think you're the right person to sort of wrap it up for us, because you do ratings, and one of your sources for ratings are reports. And you also engage with other methods to understand what stakeholder expectations are of companies. So how do you put all this together, and how do tools like AI, ML help in this process? How do you sort of paint this picture for your customer, your client, in terms of what the stakeholders are looking for, and where does reporting fit into all this? So if you could just sum that up for us in neatly, that would be a good end, and then we could get on to comments from the participants. Over to you, Gaurav.
Yeah, thank you, Shankar. At the outset, I would like to just take off from Wilhelm's point that what you do not track or report, you can never improve. So that's the whole base of doing a rating or an ESG assessment. As you mentioned, Arvindji mentioned that there are different frameworks which are there, and they are just expanding and getting more and more sectoral in nature. Very soon you'll have all 26 letters of the alphabet, and it'll be difficult for us to remember, what are the frameworks. But at the core of it, we have to understand what this is, ESG, and how you are aligned. So what we do or try to do in our frameworks, of course, incorporate all the relevant frameworks, which are domestic or global, in terms of issues and data points. But the flow has to be something you link to. One is, of course, the UN SDGs, which I would like to bring up over here, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They are pretty overarching. And if you see, all frameworks kind of feed into that. After that, we have the intended nationally determined contributions, the INDCs, which the government of India has set. And if we align to these two and then to a BRSR, right, I think we will be pretty much covered globally as well as domestically. The rest is how you input the data, how you calculate. Someone will have more materiality for a certain item or a lesser weightage for a certain item. As Dr. Karan mentioned, that hospitals will have to focus differently on certain aspects, vis-a-vis Hindustan, Unilever, etc. We try to bring sense into all of this. Okay? And we say we collect all the publicly disclosed data. This is again, in a sense, all automated, right? There are crawlers, web crawlers, and all of that. It's all comes in. There is no interface, gets bound into a system. The system, there are internal quality checks, again, which are automated in nature. We have incidentally a more than 97% plus accuracy rate of the data we collect across sources. And we pick it up from sustainability reports from pretty much everywhere. This then turns out a rating or some kind of assessment. We also do it for the unlisted clients. And very interestingly, a few supply chain partners have come into us whom we are commencing assessments. Of course, this is an engagement process. That's two. So reporting is essential, but we as a sector and a specific company have to understand what is it we want to do. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, what stage at I am. Also, very important, which I think India needs to do to bring in sustainable investment, is to start setting targets, which is an area we can definitely improve on. So to give you an example, if on a scale of 1 to 10, I am a small company, I'm at 1, I want to move to 3, it's phenomenal in 2 years. If I'm a large organization at 7, and I say I will move to 7.5, I don't think it's good enough. So we should not have absolute benchmarking and targets, but we all have to start the journey to dramatically move from where we are to where to. And ESG assessment also helps with that, because there are some target setting data points which you can utilize to set future goals over there. The next item apart from target setting is about the expectation management of stakeholders. We've all said, which stakeholders are impacted. We should also ask stakeholders, what are you looking at? The other way, the other end of the funnel. And to help that and organizations, we track what are known as controversies. A lot of organizations are doing that, but we find some very interesting trends and which enables stakeholders to ask the right questions to companies and the companies to themselves internally. Just to give you a very small example, immediately post-COVID in the last year, business ethics related issues jumped from a sheer 50 or 16 number to over 170 in just 1 year. And all of them were related to accounting frauds, mismanagement of money, twisting certain listing guidelines. It's as if, post-COVID, everyone is trying to recover their lost money. Right? So that is something very pertinent from an investor and a regular perspective, which they should be looking at. Even organizations too should pay a little more attention to that. Similarly, the other top 2-3 items we have discovered are GHG emissions. This is actually going up in a few cases rather than coming down. I don't know if you're aware, in 2021, 36.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide was released in the air. It's the highest ever till date, and it has more than offset 2 years of our COVID shutdown. It's like we are coming back with a vengeance. That is where target setting becomes important. Also, what are the items related to employee safety, product safety, and the different customers we spoke about, or the stakeholders. Now, all of that now can happen through systems. We can crawl the web, we get opinions, we get feedback, we get news items. Of course, all of this is put into a model. The model works it out, and then we get our analysis, which is fairly comprehensive and also pretty granular. So now we can tag certain type of issues to certain sectors, and we have those trends coming in place. So this is how AI and ML will help us in the reporting. And therefore, reporting will become more meaningful to organizations, right? For example, Dalmia will then not have to worry too much about reporting in that sense. They'll get their relevant reporting, or Hindustan Unilever or an Apollo Hospital. So that's pretty much what I have to say in terms of
Perfect. So I think what you're saying is that there is a lot of data out there, which are what stakeholders are expecting, what stakeholders are responding to, and it's a matter of then how do we put all that together. But one of the things that you can clearly see emerging is that the expectation is not just how you performed in the past, but what you're planning to do in the future. That becomes a very much an integral part of what the expectation is from stakeholders. And so reporting will move in that direction inexorably to the future. So great. So thanks very much. Nidhi, I think there are a few questions. So if I can request 5 minutes from all of you. We can just take a few questions and then close the session. Is that all right? Karan, Gaurang, Willem?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Nidhi, can I just ask you to, or Abha, can I just request you to take
Am
up
I
a couple
audible?
of those questions? Yeah.
Am I audible? Yeah. So I just wanted to say that Willem has to leave in case he has a call. So if you're not able to stay, then we're fine. I mean,
So if you have to leave, Willem, then we will of course let you go and thank you very much. But if you have 2-3 minutes, if there is a question for Willem, then he could just quickly respond to that and then he could leave. So tell me, Willem, how are you in terms of time?
Unfortunately, I have my extra guest waiting here, but I thank you very much for the panel. If there's a question, no problem for me to answer later in the chat as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Willem. Thank you. Very, very helpful, very insightful, and we learned a lot. So thank you very much, and we'll let you go for your next meeting. Okay. Thanks.
Great.
thanks.
Yeah, I'll have back to you. So,
And coming to the questions, I would like to say the appreciation has already started pouring in. And there are two questions I have for Dr. Budhankar. One is, what are the major difficulties that you faced while incorporating BRSR for the first time? And the other is, are we limiting our scope by only focusing on ESG? Can we see further expansion in monitoring parameter?
So the first question is what difficulties we faced. I don't think we had a major challenge because we have been reporting for last several years now. Since I think 12-13 we have been reporting. So we have that process put in place. Major efforts requires is getting the data collated. And unless and until you have that channel mapped within the organization from where what kind of data and the quality of data flows in. So more or less, although we did not have a digital platform and a lot of manual this thing had to be done, but our process was more or less set. Because of the attrition, so the one of the issues which we faced was about the knowledge transfer. So when people move, the work which he has been doing for 3 to 4 years, if the knowledge transfer doesn't happen, the new person has to start with the scratch, and we have to do a lot of competency building and capability building. So apart from this one challenge, I think we were pretty much there. So when we have to report on the 9 principles and the other this thing, more or less the data is available if you are doing GRI or IR. So that's not an issue. The only issue about the knowledge transfer which we faced. The second one on monitoring, if I understand that correctly, so monitoring, of course, for a cement industry is essential. We have a very robust governance mechanism on ESG. We have a ESG and risk committee at the board level. And we have monitoring committees, governance committees at the unit level also. And the KPIs on the ESG, all those 200, 200 plus the KPIs what we have on environmental, social, and governance. So we do keep tracking those on a regular basis, performance. Not that we are 100% that we still have gaps in governance. We do have gaps in social, but environment, we are pretty much there. We understand clearly what needs to be done, and we have been tracking that. So monitoring, we have a robust mechanism put in place.
Thank you, Arvind. I just saw one more question, which perhaps which I could ask either Karan or Gaurang to respond to, which is on the whole issue of materiality. I mean, the question is around India-specific ERPs to sort of track what is material to them. So I'm just wondering whether that's any of you would like to respond to that question, which is in the chat to Rohit sir.
I can take that if it's fine, Robert.
Sure, Gaurav.
Since pretty much is our business line, so to speak. Yeah. So there is nothing known as an India-specific materiality to answer a question, right? Materiality or the relevance of issues is the same pretty much throughout the world. When you look at ESG, it is just the importance to give or the weightages you give to certain parameters would vary. right? Just to bring back to my analogy of manufacturing versus services, or an extraction industry versus an IT industry, the materiality would be different, but the issues remain the same. They may be very small, right? If you look at GHG emissions for a trading company, which is very large in number, right? It may be much smaller, but if you look at someone into power generation, they would need to look at it in a very large way. So both are tracked, but the weightage is what we call the materiality is different. That's how it runs. All of them are pretty much standardized in terms of the EU taxonomy, GRI, and number of key issues, etc. Some will have 33 key issues, some have 35. Now someone is having 37 also. It goes by, but it pretty much covers all aspects of ESG. That is how materiality is built up, or a model of assessment is built up. I would just like to add a little bit over there in terms of the monitoring question which came. We take this further, and now very soon we are going to have ESG impact ratings, right, as we go along. And this is pretty much also there in the conversation and discussions of regulators. So we will not end at first is an as-is assessment, which I spoke about, then is a target setting assessment or process, and third is the impact, which we actually measure. And on an ongoing basis or a periodic basis, that completes the cycle. That's pretty much how it's going. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Gaurav. I see we are now finished the hour. We started a few minutes late, but I think we are at the end of the hour. So I guess we should wrap up, Abha. So I think we will. So I'm not going to try and summarize this rich discussion. It's beyond my capability to summarize it. But I think there have been some very, very important points that have emerged. I think one is very clearly the fact that that there is obviously some stakeholders are more have more weight compared to the others, which is apparent, and there will also be some issues, some sustainability issues that will be more material or more relevant to some companies than others. So I think one definitely takeaway is that is something that we perhaps many of us knew, but those who are new to sustainability, that the idea that the same issue is not necessarily important everywhere. So greenhouse gases might be very, very critical for Dalmia, but less so for Apollo. And I think those are important aspects to sort of grapple with, and therefore reporting needs to be along what is material, and that's really when it becomes useful. Otherwise, you get dumped with so much of information that you don't know what to do with. But clearly, reporting is an element of stakeholder engagement. It is a very important aspect of it, but it's not the whole thing. And it's one of the tools, as Arvind put it. There are multiple other tools, and you would have heard from all our speakers the different ways that they need to engage with their key stakeholders to make sure that the message and the responses get to them. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Karan. Thank you, Gaurav, very much for your inputs, your insights. And thank you, Abha, Fiki, and the participants for this very, very informative 1 hour. Thank you. Back to you, Abha.
And what a finale it has been. Congratulations to the panel and chair for very meaningful discussions today. We thank all of you for sharing your insights, and I think I speak for the audience when I say the deliberations have been truly enriching. It would be in order for us to also thank our audience who have stayed with us yesterday and today. We would like to have your feedback on further discussions that you would want us to organize, and also on the summit that we are concluding today. Thank you, and look forward to your support and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.